Now, when it comes to a Star Wars book, there's usually two ways I sort of judge them. The first is if it's a good story and or book in its own right. Is it well written and enjoyable? Do I actually want to keep turning the pages? Or am I only doing it because it's Star Wars and I usually read everything Star Wars? The second way I judge them is the more in-universe perspective. Does it actually feel like Star Wars, or like it belongs in and takes me to that galaxy far, far away? Do the characters, events, and everything else mesh well with what Star Wars is and is all about, at least from my perspective? And does it make sense and align with the lore and all that's been established elsewhere before? Or is it maybe missing that something special and just feels like generic sci-fi? Or worse yet, does it maybe break or conflict with the lore? And so that's how I'll approach this review for Light of the Jedi, the new novel by Charles Soule, and what is essentially the first story and foundation of the High Republic era. The first part of this review will then be me briefly giving my thoughts on the quality of the book itself, with no real or major story spoilers. And then the second part of the review, and I'll give you a warning when we get there, will be me digging into and discussing some of the details of the story itself. I'll give my thoughts on a few different things from that in-universe perspective. I certainly won't cover everything. For better or worse, there's a lot that could be discussed, but I'll go over some of the more major or overarching things from the book. But first, and sorry for this long preamble, but let me again say, as I said in my review of that first comic book in this era the other day, that I'm going into all this, the High Republic era, completely open-minded. I haven't predetermined if I'm going to love or hate this. I'm actually going to read the content and come to my own conclusions, and then honestly tell you what I think either way. And so then when it comes to this first book, The Light of the Jedi, I can honestly tell you I enjoyed it quite a bit. The story itself is rather engaging and makes you want to keep reading, especially the first 100 or so pages, which directly deals with this major event or tragedy or accident that has occurred in hyperspace, where a ship has essentially exploded and is raining debris across the Outer Rim, which is nowhere near as bad of a premise as I initially feared it might be, and it all does get explained rather well. I also thought, for the most part, this was a pretty well-written book that maybe had one sort of glaring issue or problem, which isn't even necessarily the author's fault, which is that he's tasked with sort of setting the stage for not only a much larger, interconnected story overall, but for a whole time period in Star Wars. He's not just allowed to tell a single story where he can sort of world build at his own leisure or as need dictates, and you can tell at times he's purposely going, shall we say, further than he needs to with things, if that even makes sense. And this sort of leads to the problem of it feeling like more characters are being introduced and brought in and then partially focused on than really needs to be. And though having a lot of characters and points of view isn't always a problem or a bad thing, and it can sometimes be fantastic, just look at A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones, for example, where you see the world through many different eyes and mindsets. Here the problem is many of the characters feel very similar though, what with many of them being Jedi who, let's be honest, can be sort of bland characters just by their very nature. And especially here in this book, though I don't want to say they're bland, many of them do come off as just feeling very similar, very righteous or virtuous and sort of near perfect. Not that that in itself is a problem. This is the height of the Jedi Order after all, so of course we'd sort of get an idealized version of the Jedi. I do think it makes sense, but it does leave a lot of them feeling very similar or like the same character, or difficult to immediately distinguish which is which, especially again, when there's so many of them coming at you all at once. Though that said, it's not that they're overly annoying or come off snide or unlikable or anything quite like that. They don't come off so high and mighty and perfect that you sort of resent them for the way they are or want to roll your eyes, even though some of their dialogue at times, is a touch cheesy or cliche. Still, that's always kind of been a part of Star Wars, the cheesy dialogue, I mean. And I'm happy to say I did like pretty much all the new Jedi, and for the most part, the sense or feeling of the Order at this time was good. It's just that, again, some of them do sort of blur together, and when I read a name, I'd always sort of have to remind myself which one this is exactly. Which then makes it feel like they could have and should have been a bit more characterization in this book. They should have tried to flesh these individual characters out just a bit more, or include less of them, and all of this, I think, is one of the weaknesses of the book, one of the few, that you don't really get to know these characters all too well or really connect with them. Though, like I said, it was trying to set up this whole time period and all of these different stories and threats, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot more about each of these characters in time. I will say that one of the absolute best things about this book, though, is that stuff, major stuff, actually happens, and some of it is rather surprising or unexpected. And since none of these characters are established, if you will, and this time period is virtually a blank slate, You really don't know which are going to live or die or what's going to happen next, which is a very refreshing change of pace when compared to almost all other books in the new canon. Because though plenty of the new Star Wars books or books in the new canon are at least decent enough reads, they are usually very predictable because they include very well established characters in very well known time periods and are meant to, I guess, flesh out a story or a character more so than progress anything. Not to mention big things or events are usually saved or reserved for the movies or shows. Whereas back in the days of the expanded universe, for example, the books were the main story. They were where all the big things were happening, where the story was progressing. And so this was the first Star Wars book in a long time that gave me that feeling again, that feeling of true uncertainty and like I was reading an epic story that could go any number of ways. And it gets exploited well because, again, you are surprised by some of the things that do transpire. And so overall, I think this is a good book, a good story, and a solid enough way to kick off a whole new era of Star Wars. Yes, it could stand to be, I guess, a bit longer, or maybe just a bit more focused on a few characters. It does kind of feel a bit like a sampler tray, if you will, but at least every character or story does manage to weave its way into the bigger picture. There is no side plot that feels there just for the sake of it, so I do give Charles Soule, the author, credit for that. However, there were some interesting things or issues when it comes to the more in-universe stuff. Nothing by any stretch that really broke the story or makes me overly concerned for the whole time period now, or to want to give up on this whole thing. And so, yes, that means we're now moving into spoiler territory here, so click away now if you don't want anything in the book ruined. Okay, so the first thing I found very curious is just how much this book sort of used, explored, and explained hyperspace, to the point where you start to feel like we have maybe some concrete rules in regards to it, or at least a foundation for them. I mean, the story even actually centers around it, even though usually hyperspace travel, especially in the movies and shows, is a completely arbitrary or open-ended thing. You could even say it's something taken for granted. And I often joke that hyperspace travel takes as long or as short as the plot requires, and nowhere is that more evident than in The Rise of Skywalker, where it seems almost instantaneous at times, because they have to jump all over the galaxy in less than a single day. Yet here in this book, we're basically told right at the beginning that it takes several days to get to the outer rim from the mid-rim, though do keep in mind this was, in story, 200 years ago, and it's heavily implied, or basically said, that the events of the book would lead to progress in terms of hyperspace travel, so it might sort of be explained why it seems, or usually seems, much faster in the time period of the Skywalker saga, or at least is faster when it needs to be. But this all does come with the catch that you're kind of given this sense or feeling that hyperspace travel is rather primitive in this time period, or is only now starting to become, I don't know, I guess you could say, a perfected means of travel, or a practical means. And that's because it's made very clear that the Outer Rim is virtually unexplored at this time, that it's basically the frontier, and the main overall premise here is that the Jedi are like rangers looking to sort of patrol the frontier as it's settled, as people move out of the overcrowded core worlds and mid-rim worlds. And at one point, a Jedi by the name of Porter Ingle, who is 300 years old, remarks that, "I remember when the galaxy was just pulling itself together a few centuries back, we couldn't even think about anything but survival," which feels like an odd statement to make because we know there's been hyperspace travel in the galaxy for thousands of years, going all the way back to the Old Republic era. And so I'm not sure what I should really take away from all this. Did something happen in the not too distant past that completely divided the galaxy and it's only come back together relatively recently? Or will the Old Republic era be nothing like it once was before? Or will we find out something has happened in the meantime where a lot of the advances in technology and in hyperspace travel got lost at some point? Some galaxy-wide reset type event, perhaps? Furthermore, we learn that the Senteca clan, and yes, I'm assuming they're related to Lord Senteca from The Force Awakens, that they've made a fortune and are some of the richest people in the galaxy off mapping out hyperspace lanes in the not-too-distant past even. So, again, we're really given the impression that 200 years before the prequels, it was then just starting to become popular or useful to use hyperspace travel, or maybe I should say practical to do it. Also in this book, we see hyperspace travel used as a sort of weapon or tactic towards the end of the book when the Nil or the Nile, and I'll talk more about them in a bit, they make mini jumps using what they call paths, which are essentially hyperspace lanes known only to them, And they get these from a member of the Senteca clan, a woman named Marie Senteca, who has been kept alive well beyond her normal lifespan by the leaders or leader of the Nil, which might sound like a whole silly sort of premise, but it was one of the more interesting parts of the book, I thought. Anyway, this Marie Senteca can make instant hyperspace calculations with her mind, and she finds new lanes and such with ease, and reminds me a lot of the Chiss Skywalkers in the recent Thrawn novels, who could do something very similar, though they used the Force. Anyway, in the climactic final battle, the Nil use a tactic where they make micro hyperspace jumps, and even start flying their ships into the Republic task force doing it. Almost like mini Holdo maneuvers, and it does make me wonder if they're setting that up somehow or explaining it, but I think I'll save that talk for a future video. Instead here, let's talk a bit more about the Nil or the Nile. I'm not sure which way to pronounce it. I'll keep going with Nil, I guess. Anyway, we were told that they would be the big bad guys of this time period, or one of them, and at first, honestly, they felt really kind of generic, both in story and out of it, because they weren't portrayed to be such a major threat or anything in the story. They weren't even on the Republic or Jedi's radar until it was learned they were responsible for this hyperspace incident. Until then, they were just sort of nuisances in the Outer Rim, known only to those who lived out there. But after it was learned they were responsible for this hyperspace incident, and this was one of my favorite parts of the book, the Republic requested the help or aid of the Jedi, and the Council actually got together and discussed if it was their place to get involved. And they end up sort of debating amongst themselves whether or not it's the will of the Force for them to intervene in this matter, and the votes ended up being split, but it ultimately came down to the question of, will this bring light to the galaxy to get rid of the Nil? And they argued it would, and so they partook in the final battle against them. And I think this is great because, though at first we are kind of given the impression that the Jedi of this time period are much like the Jedi of the prequels, that they're just an arm of the Republic or a tool to be used by them, that turns out not to be the case at all, at least not right now. And I do feel like we're on the cusp of that happening for good, where the Jedi of the prequels care less about the will of the Force and more about the will of the Republic. In other words, in a lot of ways, not just this one, this really does feel like a story that is a precursor to the prequel era, or will explain how the Order gets to the point where they're susceptible to the Sith or Palpatine's plan, and that they do fall. But going back to the Nil for a moment, and how at first they really aren't anything special in this book, and you're left wondering, why in the world did Lucasfilm hype this group up? Well, it turns out this book actually shows how they will become such a huge threat going forward. And sure, maybe how it's all done is a touch convoluted, but I still liked it. I liked that their leader, Marchion Ro, and he was one of the better characters in the book, that he turns out to be some sort of, or have some sort of history with the Jedi, and wants vengeance on them for something. He's even revealed to have this strange item, sort of like a staff or something similar to it, that's cylindrical and is 3 hand lengths long, which sounds maybe like a type of lightsaber. Anyway, it glows purple at one point, and we really don't learn anything too much about it. We don't have it revealed till the very end of the book. But it all left me wondering if this will have something to do with the Sith. If this guy is going to bring them back, instead of them having been around and laying low and plotting for 1,000 years. I mean, that's pure speculation or straight up guessing at this point, and I have a very hard time believing they'd make it that obvious, but that's a change that I don't know how I'd feel about. I don't know how I'd feel about them somehow being brought back instead of being kind of there all along, unless he maybe teams up with the Sith that are actually still out there. But anyway, setting that aside, I think the Jedi in here were maybe just a bit too powerful overall. I mean, I get that they really wanted to emphasize that this is the height of their power, that in the grand scheme of things, they're on the cusp of their fall as seen in the prequels, but I thought they were borderline superheroes at time, and only the fact that we do see many of them die kind of pulled me back from feeling that way and balanced them out. I mean, at one point we see Force Smell used, a power that existed in Legends, and it's used to join together several Jedi and their powers in order to alter the course of a super fast-moving large object, a tank of Tabana gas actually, and they're stopping it from crashing into a sun and blowing up the whole system, which is one of those things that, especially if I saw it in a Star Wars movie, would feel like a little bit too much, and kind of comes off feeling that way here too. And I've already seen some people grumbling that they're trying to make the Jedi of this time period better than the prequel or original trilogy Jedi, but I do think it needs to be kept in mind that, again, these Jedi are setting up the fall of the whole order in the not too distant future. And as I've said before, my biggest hope for this whole story, other than, yes, it just being good in and of itself, is that it explains why the Jedi are the way they are in the prequels, and them being this very powerful and righteous group who are expanding their order and have this belief that they can save and protect everyone and everything in the galaxy is potentially a good way to do that. And the same goes for the Republic. We know it will become rife with corruption and will ultimately fail and fall to Palpatine, even though right now it's made out to be a perfect system. And there's this saying that they all have, which is, "We are all the Republic." And the current Chancellor is a devout believer in all of this. She has drank all the Kool-Aid and really believes she can make the galaxy as perfect as it can ever possibly be. And you might say, and again I've seen some people grumbling about this, that it's all pushing, and maybe not so covertly, some sort of agenda here. But if that is the case, again, it needs to be remembered that everything we see here or read about will fail. The Republic and Jedi Order as they are in this time period, as these thought to be perfect ideas, will fail and fall. And as Dooku said, twice the pride, double the fall. In other words, I think it's fine that they're portrayed to have it all or mostly all figured out, and that they feel like they can withstand anything or do anything, when we know that won't be the case. In many ways, this story has to end in a sort of tragedy or to set up that future one. Alright, so to sort of sum it all up here, and yeah, there is lots and lots yet I could still talk about, and some things I may make individual videos on, but I don't want to drone on too long here in this one video. Not to mention this is just the beginning of the High Republic project, so plenty more videos discussing it all are to come. But anyway, to sum it all up, to sum up the opening book that launches a whole new era of Star Wars, well, I did think it was good and enjoyable, and that the story laid the foundation for potentially a very good larger Star Wars story, and yeah, a whole Star Wars time period. There are some questions about the direction some things are going in, and what it could mean for other eras even, but we'll have to wait and see where they do indeed go with this, and how it all gets explained. I did think specifically pertaining to this book that a bit more characterization was needed, and that not many of the characters really stuck out because we bounced around quite a bit, and relatively speaking, this wasn't a very long book, and so I wasn't left with a great sense about who any of them really are, and I guess I have to read all the offshoot material to learn more, which I was going to do anyway, sure, but if you're someone just reading the core story, that kind of sucks. I also found it more than a little curious just how much we go into hyperspace travel. That again, this is something Star Wars has always just kind of taken for granted, and now it looks like we'll have some really hard and fast rules laid out, which is great and all on the surface, but there are many instances in Star Wars where I don't know how you could make sense of the way hyperspace travel was used, and I'm pretty sure plenty of the filmmakers in the future won't be so keen to try to adhere to these very strict rules they're laying out. And I also can't help but feel like when it's all said and done, they'll give us an answer or try to give us an answer as to why the Holdo maneuver was such a rare one-time occurrence. I think the Nil, well, they started out as sort of a joke, but have potential to be really good, interesting villains in the long run. And speaking of villains, at the end of the book, a Jedi has a vision about some very dark things coming out of the shadows, which I'm guessing are the Drenger, aka the plant monsters, which, unless I missed it somewhere, were not really hinted at or alluded to at all in this book, unless they have something to do with this mystery item that the leader of the Nil has. Either way, I have to say this wasn't a bad start to the High Republic, much better than issue number 1 of the High Republic comic series from Marvel, and I can happily say I'm actually looking forward to reading more. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me if you've read Light of the Jedi and what you thought of it. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.